It was a warm Saturday morning in early autumn. The sun shone brightly over the small town of Mapleton, casting long shadows over the oak trees that lined the streets. Birds chirped overhead as the local coffee shop buzzed with customers starting their weekend. To anyone walking by, it seemed like the kind of peaceful day Mapleton was known for: calm, predictable, and safe. At least, that's what Maria Thompson thought as she pulled out of her driveway. Maria was a well-known figure in Mapleton. At 32, she had been a teacher at the local elementary school for nearly a decade. She was respected not only for her ability to connect with her students, but also for her dedication to the community. On top of her teaching duties, she was a part-time civil court judge, volunteering her legal expertise in small claims and civil rights cases. Her unique role in both the classroom and the courtroom gave her a deep sense of responsibility to the town, and she took pride in making Mapleton a better place. Today, however, Maria's mind wasn't on her professional responsibilities. She was 7 months pregnant and focused on preparing for her upcoming baby shower. She was excited but tired, balancing the physical toll of pregnancy with the excitement of welcoming her first child. Her husband, James, was equally thrilled and had spent the past few weeks assembling cribs, painting the nursery, and collecting tiny baby clothes. James worked long hours as a construction worker, and he had insisted Maria take it easy today while he finished up a project across town. Maria had a few errands to run before the shower, picking up some last-minute groceries, dropping off invitations, and swinging by the local bakery for her favorite pastries. As she drove through Mapleton's tree-lined streets, she couldn't help but feel a sense of contentment. Life, for the most part, was good. As she pulled into the parking lot of Mapleton Grocers, she noticed how quiet the town was. The early morning fog had lifted, leaving the air crisp and clear. Maria parked her car and made her way inside, smiling and waving to a few familiar faces along the way. The shopkeepers greeted her warmly, commenting on her pregnancy and offering congratulations. After picking up the groceries she needed, Maria walked back to her car, glancing at her watch. She was making good time and would be home by mid-morning, just in time to relax before the shower. As she loaded the groceries into the trunk, she felt a sudden, sharp kick from her baby. She smiled to herself, placing a hand on her belly, murmuring softly, "You're going to love this town, little one." With the groceries safely packed, she started her car and pulled out of the parking lot. The day still felt peaceful, just another Saturday in Mapleton. But as Maria drove through town, heading toward the bakery, she noticed something that set her on edge. A police car, its lights flashing, suddenly appeared in her rearview mirror. At first, she thought nothing of it. After all, she hadn't done anything wrong. But then the car stayed right behind her, close enough to make her uneasy. She looked down at her speedometer. She wasn't speeding. There was no reason for the police to pull her over. Still, the flashing lights remained, and the officer behind her blared his siren, signaling her to pull over. Maria's heart sank. She pulled off to the side of the road, confused and slightly nervous. Was this about her car registration? Had she run a red light without noticing? She couldn't imagine what the issue could be. As she put the car in park, she glanced out her window, watching the officer approach. As she pulled into the parking lot of Mapleton Grocers, she noticed how quiet the town was. The early morning fog had lifted, leaving the air crisp and clear. Maria parked her car and made her way inside, smiling and waving to a few familiar faces along the way. The shopkeepers greeted her warmly, commenting on her pregnancy and offering congratulations. After picking up the groceries she needed, Maria walked back to her car, glancing at her watch. She was making good time and would be home by mid-morning, just in time to relax before the shower. As she loaded the groceries into the trunk, she felt a sudden, sharp kick from her baby. She smiled to herself, placing a hand on her belly, murmuring softly, "You're going to love this town, little one." With the groceries safely packed, she started her car and pulled out of the parking lot. The day still felt peaceful, just another Saturday in Mapleton. But as Maria drove through town, heading toward the bakery, she noticed something that set her on edge. A police car, its lights flashing, suddenly appeared in her rearview mirror. At first, she thought nothing of it. After all, she hadn't done anything wrong. But then the car stayed right behind her, close enough to make her uneasy. She looked down at her speedometer. She wasn't speeding. There was no reason for the police to pull her over. Still, the flashing lights remained, and the officer behind her blared his siren, signaling her to pull over. The officer who stepped out of the squad car was a tall, stern-faced man named Officer Garrett. Maria had seen him around town before. He was known for being strict but fair. She rolled down her window, her hands visibly on the steering wheel, trying to remain calm. She was pregnant, after all, and stress wasn't something she needed right now. License and registration. Officer Garrett barked, his tone clipped and impersonal. Maria furrowed her brow, but she complied. She reached into her glove compartment and pulled out her registration, then handed her driver's license over as well. "Is everything okay, officer?" "I'm not sure what I did wrong," she asked politely. Officer Garrett looked at her documents without responding, his eyes darting between her and the paperwork. After a moment, he stepped back, eyeing the car suspiciously. "You were driving erratically," he said curtly. "Swerving." Maria blinked. "Swerving. I'm sorry, officer, but I didn't realize." "Step out of the car," he interrupted, his voice sharp. Maria's pulse quickened. This wasn't right. She hadn't done anything wrong, and now he was asking her to step out of the car. She hesitated, her hand instinctively going to her belly. "Officer, I'm 7 months pregnant," she said, her voice calm but firm. "I don't think it's safe for me to be getting out of the car right now." Her reasonable tone didn't seem to reach him. Instead, Officer Garrett's face tightened, as if her explanation had annoyed him further. "I'm not going to ask you again, ma'am. Step out of the vehicle." Maria's heart raced. She was suddenly very aware of how alone she was on this quiet street. There were no other cars around, no witnesses. She reached for her phone, her fingers trembling as she considered calling her husband or even recording the encounter. But before she could do either, Officer Garrett reached for her door handle, yanking the door open with a force that startled her. "Step out now," he growled. Maria's breath caught in her throat. This situation had escalated far beyond anything she could have anticipated. She unbuckled her seatbelt and gingerly stepped out of the car, her hand still protectively over her belly. As she stood, her knees wobbled slightly. "I really don't understand what's happening," she said, her voice wavering. "Turn around, hands on the car," Officer Garrett ordered, his voice growing more impatient. Maria, trying to keep calm, slowly turned and placed her hands on the hood of the car. Her mind raced. This had to be some kind of mistake. Maybe he thought she was someone else. "Officer, please, I haven't done anything wrong," she pleaded, but her words fell on deaf ears. Suddenly, she felt a sharp, painful tug on her arm. Before she could react, Officer Garrett forcefully yanked her arms behind her back. Panic surged through her as she felt the cold metal of handcuffs snap around her wrists. "Stop resisting," he shouted, though Maria hadn't moved. Her heart pounded in her chest. "Officer, I'm pregnant. Please," she cried out, her voice breaking. But Officer Garrett wasn't listening. In a split second, he swung his fist toward her face. The punch connected with a sickening force, sending Maria crashing to the ground. She landed hard on her side, her head spinning, her vision blurring from the impact. Her baby, her precious baby, was all she could think about. Everything went quiet. For a moment, Maria couldn't breathe. She lay on the pavement, clutching her stomach, gasping for air. Pain radiated through her face, and she felt the warmth of blood trickling down her cheek. The world around her spun as she struggled to comprehend what had just happened. "He punched me," she thought, disbelief flooding her mind. "He actually punched me." Bystanders, previously absent from the scene, had started to gather. Several people pulled out their phones, recording the horrific incident. Shouts of protest erupted from those watching, but Officer Garrett seemed oblivious, his face still twisted in anger. A woman from across the street ran over, kneeling beside Maria. "Oh my God, are you okay? What did he do to you?" she asked frantically, her phone still recording. Maria couldn't respond. Her world was spinning, her thoughts consumed with fear for her unborn child. As sirens wailed in the distance, drawing closer, all she could do was hold her belly and pray her baby was still okay. And then the realization hit her. Officer Garrett had no idea who she was. He had no idea that the woman he'd just assaulted wasn't just an ordinary resident of Mapleton. He didn't know that she was Judge Maria Thompson. And this was only the beginning. Time seemed to slow down as Maria lay on the cold, unforgiving pavement, her cheek still stinging from the brutal punch. The metallic taste of blood filled her mouth, and her head throbbed with pain. Her thoughts, however, weren't on herself. They were consumed by fear for her unborn baby. As she cradled her belly with shaking hands, the gravity of the situation began to sink in. She, Maria Thompson, a respected teacher, a judge, and a soon-to-be mother, had just been violently assaulted by a police officer in broad daylight. The world around her was chaotic now, far removed from the peaceful Saturday morning it had once been. Voices blurred together as bystanders began to converge on the scene. Some were yelling at Officer Garrett, their voices filled with disbelief and anger. Others were frantically dialing 911, calling for an ambulance, as the sight of a pregnant woman lying on the ground, bleeding, and in obvious distress, sent shockwaves through the small town of Mapleton. "Someone help her," a woman shouted from the crowd, her voice trembling with urgency. Officer Garrett, however, seemed unfazed by the chaos he had just unleashed. He stood tall, his hands now resting on his belt, his expression one of steely indifference. He glanced down at Maria as if she were nothing more than a minor inconvenience, completely oblivious to the life-changing consequences of his actions. He had no idea who she was or what kind of storm was about to hit him. To him, she was just another suspect in his eyes, someone who had dared to defy him. Maria struggled to lift her head. Her vision was still blurry, and the sharp pain in her abdomen grew with every passing second. A sense of helplessness washed over her, but at the same time, a deep, simmering anger began to stir. This wasn't just about her anymore. This was about the life she carried inside her, the future that she had so carefully planned. In that moment, as she lay on the ground, Maria knew that her life, and her baby's life, hung in the balance. A tall man in his mid-40s, wearing a flannel shirt and a baseball cap, was the first to approach Maria. His name was Tom Richardson, and he was a local mechanic who had known Maria since childhood. He knelt beside her, his face filled with concern. Maria, can you hear me?" Tom's voice was calm, but his hands trembled as he reached out to help her sit up. "I saw what he did. This is not right. Stay still. Help is coming." Maria blinked, trying to focus. "My baby," she gasped, clutching her stomach. "Please, my baby." Tom's face paled. "We'll get you to the hospital," he said softly, but his eyes were fixed on Officer Garrett, who still stood there, unmoved by the growing crowd. Anger flashed across Tom's face. "You'll pay for this," he muttered under his breath. More people gathered around, filming on their phones, shouting at Officer Garrett to help Maria. But he remained cold and distant. At this point, it wasn't just Maria's immediate pain that was at stake. This incident was becoming a symbol of something much larger. This wasn't the first time the black community in Mapleton had felt the heavy hand of law enforcement, but it was the first time it had happened to someone as beloved and respected as Maria. A younger woman named Lisa Garcia, who had also been passing by, joined Tom in helping Maria sit up. "We're here," she whispered, holding Maria's hand. "You're going to be okay. Just hold on." But as Maria sat there, her mind still racing, something in her shifted. She wasn't just a victim anymore. She was a judge. She was someone who knew the law, someone who understood justice, and someone who wasn't about to let this go. Even through the pain, her resolve hardened. This was far from over. In the distance, the sound of approaching sirens cut through the noise of the crowd. Mapleton's police department wasn't large, but the presence of an officer in trouble, especially one like Garrett, was enough to prompt backup. A second police car pulled up, its blue and red lights flashing, and out stepped Officer Jacobs, a younger, fresher-faced cop who had only been on the force for a couple of years. Officer Jacobs quickly assessed the scene, his eyes widening as he saw Maria on the ground, surrounded by concerned bystanders. His gaze then shifted to Officer Garrett, standing stiff and emotionless, and the tension between the two officers was palpable. Jacobs had heard rumors about Garrett, his quick temper, his reputation for overreacting during routine stops, but seeing it play out in front of him was something else entirely. "Garrett, what the hell happened here?" Jacobs asked, his voice low but filled with concern. The paramedics worked quickly, lifting Maria onto a stretcher as the crowd continued to grow. Some people in the background shouted at Garrett, accusing him of police brutality, while others stared in stunned silence. The once quiet street had become a chaotic scene of confusion and outrage. As Maria was loaded into the ambulance, she could hear the murmurs around her, the snippets of conversation that floated through the air. "Did you see that?" He punched her, right in the face. "She's pregnant, for God's sake. How could he do that? That man is going to lose his job. He has to." But amid the cacophony of voices, one thing stood out above all else: the sense that something irreversible had happened. Mapleton wasn't the kind of town where these kinds of things happened. It was a close-knit community, one where neighbors helped each other and people looked out for one another. Yet here she was, lying in the back of an ambulance, her future uncertain, her faith in the system shattered. The doors of the ambulance slammed shut, and as the vehicle sped toward the hospital, Maria clutched her stomach, willing her baby to stay strong. She could feel every bump in the road, each one sending a fresh wave of pain through her body. But worse than the physical pain was the gnawing fear in her heart that the life growing inside her, the child she had fought so hard for, could be in danger. Back at the scene, Officer Garrett stood watching the ambulance disappear into the distance. The crowd had grown larger, and the atmosphere had become more hostile. People were shouting now, demanding answers, calling for justice. The tension in the air was thick, like a storm about to break. Garrett's face remained impassive, but inside, doubt was beginning to creep in. He hadn't intended for things to go this far. It had been a routine stop, a minor infraction. He couldn't even remember what had triggered his anger. Was it her hesitation? The way she had spoken to him? It didn't matter now. What mattered was that things had spiraled out of control, and there was no turning back. Officer Jacobs, meanwhile, was speaking quietly into his radio, requesting a supervisor on the scene. He knew that this was bigger than just a traffic stop gone wrong. There would be investigations, lawsuits, and public outrage. And in the center of it all was Garrett, who was starting to realize that he had made a terrible mistake. As the paramedics rushed Maria into the emergency room, word began to spread through Mapleton's small-town grapevine. People whispered in disbelief as they learned the identity of the woman who had been assaulted by Officer Garrett. It wasn't just any pregnant woman. It was Judge Maria Thompson, a respected figure who had presided over civil rights cases and fought for justice in their very own community. This revelation hit the town like a bombshell. The fact that Garrett had attacked a black woman was already enough to stoke the flames of controversy, but now that it was known she was a judge, the stakes were raised tenfold. People were outraged, not just at Garrett's brutality, but at the fact that someone with power, with influence, and with the law on her side could be treated this way. The local news picked up the story, and within hours, social media was ablaze with footage of the incident. Clips of Maria lying on the pavement, bloodied and bruised, were shared thousands of times. Hashtags like #JusticeForMaria and #PolicedBrutalityMapleton began trending, drawing national attention. Inside the sterile, fluorescent-lit emergency room, the world seemed to move in slow motion. Maria lay on a hospital bed, her face bruised, her lips swollen from the punch, and her stomach tight with a mixture of fear and pain. She clutched her belly, feeling the faint flutter of her baby's movements, which brought her a sliver of hope. The doctors were working quickly, performing ultrasounds and monitoring both Maria and her baby for any signs of distress. But despite the hurried movements and concerned looks exchanged among the medical staff, all Maria could hear was a ringing in her ears. The shock had set in. It was as though the enormity of what had just happened was too much for her mind to fully process. 1 minute, she was running errands, preparing for one of the happiest days of her life, the celebration of her baby shower. And the next, she was lying on a hospital bed, a victim of violence she never could have imagined. Just as Maria was gathering her thoughts, the door to the hospital room swung open. James burst into the room, his face a mixture of panic and fury. His normally calm demeanor was gone, replaced by a look of sheer disbelief. "Maria," he exclaimed, rushing to her side. "Oh my God, are you okay? What did they do to you?" Maria's eyes filled with tears as she reached for his hand. She had been trying to stay strong, but seeing James, her anchor, her partner, broke the floodgates. She began to sob, the weight of the trauma crashing over her. "I'm okay," she whispered, though she wasn't sure if it was entirely true. "The baby's okay." But James, it was horrible. He hit me. He hit me so hard. James' jaw clenched, his fists tightening at his sides. He had heard bits and pieces of what had happened from the neighbors and the video clips circulating online, but hearing Maria say it out loud, seeing the bruises on her face, he felt an uncontrollable rage bubbling inside him. "They're going to pay for this," James growled, his voice low but filled with a dangerous edge. "That cop, Garrett, I'll make sure he never works a day in this town again." Maria squeezed his hand, but her voice was softer. "We have to be careful," she said, her mind already thinking like a judge. "This isn't just about revenge. This is about justice. For me, for our baby, and for everyone who's ever been through something like this." James nodded, though the anger in his eyes didn't fade. "Justice, then," he said firmly. "But I won't rest until that bastard is held accountable." In the small, dimly lit room of the Mapleton police station, Officer Garrett sat across from Chief Randolph, his arms crossed, his face a mask of indifference. Garrett was unshaken. To him, this was all just a big misunderstanding, an overreaction by the media and the public. "She resisted," Garrett said for what felt like the 100th time. "I followed procedure. I don't care who she is. A teacher, a judge, the Queen of England. If someone resists, I do my job." Chief Randolph's eyes narrowed. "This isn't going to fly, Garrett. There's video. There's a pregnant woman lying on the ground with your fist in her face. You're not just dealing with a routine stop anymore. This is about to blow up in ways you can't even imagine." But Garrett was defiant. "I was in control of the situation. She wouldn't comply. What was I supposed to do? Let her drive off. Let her get away with it." "Get away with what?" Randolph snapped, slamming his fist on the desk. "She wasn't doing anything illegal. She was a pregnant woman, trying to explain herself. You escalated the situation. This is on you." For the first time, Garrett's composure faltered. He shifted uncomfortably in his seat, the reality of the situation starting to sink in. But even then, he wasn't ready to admit fault. "I did what I had to do," he muttered. "I was just doing my job." Chief Randolph stood up, his face hard. "You're suspended, effective immediately. I'm not going to let you drag this department down with you." Garrett's eyes widened. "Suspended? For what?" "For excessive use of force, for failing to de-escalate, for putting a pregnant woman in the hospital," Randolph said coldly. "And trust me, this is just the beginning." As word spread that Garrett had been suspended, The protests outside the police station grew more intense. What had started as a peaceful demonstration had turned into something more volatile. People were angry, and they wanted answers. They wanted justice for Maria, and they wanted it now. Officer Jacobs, who had been at the scene after the punch, watched nervously from the window of the police station. He had known this was coming, but seeing it unfold in real time made him anxious. He hadn't done anything to stop Garrett, and that guilt gnawed at him. Outside, the crowd was chanting, their voices filling the streets of Mapleton. No justice, no peace. No justice, no peace. The police force, already small and ill-equipped to handle a protest of this magnitude, was scrambling to maintain order. More officers had been called in from neighboring towns, but it was clear that Mapleton was no longer the quiet, idyllic town it had once been. It had become the epicenter of a national conversation about race. Power, the once tranquil town of Mapleton, had become a war zone of ideology, beliefs, and fractured friendships. It was a place where everyone had known everyone, where people stopped to chat in grocery stores or waved at each other from porches. But after the incident with Maria Thompson, Mapleton was no longer the town it used to be. The divide between residents had never been more palpable. Some people in town sided with Officer Garrett, despite the viral footage of his violent actions. These were mostly people who had lived in Mapleton for generations, whose families had deep roots in the community, and who believed in the sanctity of law enforcement, no matter what. For them, Garrett had been doing his job. His defenders claimed that the media had blown things out of proportion, painting him as a racist villain when in their eyes, he was merely maintaining order in a world that seemed increasingly chaotic. Others, however, were appalled. They couldn't comprehend how anyone could justify Garrett's actions, especially after seeing the footage, hearing the screams of a pregnant woman being assaulted, and learning that Maria Thompson was not only a respected educator, but a civil court judge. The town's black community, in particular, had rallied behind Maria, not just because of her position, but because they saw themselves in her. She had become the face of their struggles, a symbol of what many had feared for years, that no matter how accomplished, no matter how respected, being black in America, being black in Mapleton, was enough to make you a target. What had once been whispered tensions between the town's black and white communities now spilled out into the open, creating a rift so wide it seemed irreparable. Families were arguing at dinner tables. Longtime friends were severing ties. And while the protesters kept their voices loud in the streets, behind closed doors, the debates raged even louder. While Mapleton citizens battled their conflicting loyalties, Maria Thompson was fighting a different kind of battle, one that was deeply personal and painfully complex. She had become the focal point of a national discussion on police brutality and race relations, but she wasn't sure if she was ready for that role. Her primary concern was her unborn baby, whose health was still uncertain after the trauma of the assault. Maria lay in her hospital bed, staring up at the ceiling as the doctors came and went, administering tests, checking vitals, and offering updates. She could feel the weight of the world pressing down on her. It wasn't just the physical pain that consumed her. It was the overwhelming sense of responsibility. Everyone was looking to her now, to speak out, to demand justice, to become the face of a movement that stretched far beyond Mapleton's borders. Her phone had been ringing off the hook for days. Civil rights activists from across the country were reaching out, eager to have her lead protests, give interviews, and put herself at the forefront of the fight. News outlets wanted exclusive interviews. Social media was awash with hashtags like #JusticeForMaria, #MapletonBrutality, and #PoliceViolence, with many people seeing her as the next potential face of the national conversation around police reform. But Maria was conflicted. She had always believed in justice, in fairness, in the idea that the system could work if people held it accountable. As a judge, she had seen the best and worst of humanity, and she knew how messy the legal process could be. She also knew how hard it was for someone like her, a black woman in a small town, to win against a system that was stacked against people who looked like her. But now she wasn't just thinking about herself. She had a family to consider. Her husband James had been steadfast in his support, but she could see the toll this was taking on him. His normally calm demeanor had been replaced by a simmering rage that he struggled to contain. He was ready for a fight, ready to take down anyone who stood in their way. But Maria worried that if they took this fight too far, it might cost them everything. She worried about their safety, about what kind of future they would be able to give their child. As much as she wanted to believe that she could fight this battle and still keep her family safe, a small voice inside her whispered doubts. Was it worth the risk? As Maria weighed her options, the town of Mapleton was unraveling. The protests had started peacefully enough. A few dozen people holding signs and chanting for justice outside the police station. But as word spread about Officer Garrett's suspension, and as more outside activists poured into Mapleton, the tension escalated. Mapleton's police department was ill-prepared for the influx of protesters, and local law enforcement struggled to maintain control. Some of the more extreme pro-police factions in town had also mobilized. These were the people who believed that law enforcement should be unquestioned, that police officers were the thin blue line standing between order and chaos. They saw Garrett as a martyr for their cause, a man being unfairly vilified by the anti-police media. Small groups of counter-protesters had started to show up, waving thin blue line flags and shouting at the activists. Soon, what had begun as a peaceful demonstration morphed into a tense standoff. At one protest, a group of Garrett supporters and Black Lives Matter activists faced off in the town square, hurling insults at each other as the police watched nervously from the sidelines. It was clear that Mapleton was no longer the quiet, idyllic town it once was. In one particularly heated moment, a group of Garrett supporters, emboldened by the chaos, attempted to march through the black side of town. They carried signs that read "Blue Lives Matter" and "Support our officers," their voices rising with aggression. The residents, many of whom were already on edge after the attack on Maria, responded with their own demonstrations. It didn't take long for things to turn violent. Shouts turned to shoves, and soon enough, fists flew. The police were called in to break up the fight, but by the time they arrived, several people had been injured, and the divide in the town had deepened further. In the midst of this growing tension, Mapleton's mayor, Daniel Wilson, found himself caught between two warring sides. Mayor Wilson had always prided himself on being a moderate, a man of reason who could navigate the town's various factions and keep the peace. But this situation was unlike anything he had ever faced. On one hand, he knew the black community had valid grievances. The footage of Garrett punching Maria was damning. And as much as Wilson wanted to avoid controversy, he couldn't deny that Maria was owed justice. On the other hand, Mayor Wilson was also deeply aware of the fact that Mapleton was, in many ways, a conservative town. The pro-police factions were loud, organized, and well-funded. Many of the town's wealthier residents supported Garrett, and these were the same people who helped fund Wilson's campaigns. To publicly side with Maria would mean alienating a large portion of his voter base. In private meetings with his advisors, Wilson vacillated between trying to find a middle ground and feeling pressure to pick a side. He had already made vague public statements about respecting the law and letting the investigation take its course. But as the situation in the streets worsened, those words felt increasingly hollow. Privately, Mayor Wilson had always supported police reform. He had pushed for better training programs for officers and had quietly met with local activists on several occasions to discuss how to address racial bias in law enforcement. But now, with the town divided, Wilson found himself paralyzed by indecision. He feared that no matter what he did, he would lose either the support of his political allies or the respect of his town's black community. His wife, Rachel, urged him to make a stand. "Daniel," she said one evening as they sat at their kitchen table, the weight of the day's events pressing down on them. "You know what's right. You've always known what's right. You can't keep sitting on the fence forever." Wilson sighed, rubbing his temples. "If I side with Maria, we lose half the town. If I side with Garrett, we lose the other half. I'm trying to keep Mapleton together." Rachel shook her head. Maybe it's already too late for that. Maybe it's not about keeping the town together anymore. Maybe it's about doing the right thing. Wilson looked at her, his heart heavy. He knew she was right, but the weight of leadership, of trying to please everyone, was suffocating him. As the town simmered with tension, Maria remained in the hospital, recovering from her injuries and grappling with the enormity of the decision before her. Civil rights lawyers had approached her, offering to take on her case, pro bono. They wanted to file a lawsuit against Officer Garrett, the police department, and even the town itself for allowing a culture of racism to fester. The media was clamoring for a statement, and national figures were already speaking out in her defense. But Maria was torn. On one hand, she knew that fighting back was the right thing to do. She had been assaulted, her life and the life of her unborn child had been put at risk, and she had every right to demand justice. She had seen too many cases like hers, too many people who had been silenced or ignored when they sought justice. But on the other hand, she feared for her family. The protests were growing more violent, and the vitriol on social media was frightening. She and James had already. Maria Thompson sat in the front row of the packed courtroom, her face still marked by the faint bruises from the punch that had changed everything. The world outside Mapleton's courthouse had shifted dramatically since the day Officer Garrett assaulted her. What started as a local act of police brutality had grown into a national firestorm of controversy. Now, the courtroom was the battleground where justice, or the denial of it, would be decided. The air in the courtroom was thick with tension. Rows of spectators sat in silence, watching the judge, the lawyers, and especially Maria. On one side of the courtroom sat the black community, activists and supporters of Maria, some holding their breath as if the future of justice itself was on trial. On the other side, there were Officer Garrett's defenders, people who believed in the sanctity of law enforcement, who saw Garrett as a man unjustly accused of wrongdoing in the face of a chaotic situation. Maria's lawyer, Rebecca Wells, was known throughout the state as a fierce civil rights attorney who had taken on some of the most high-profile police brutality cases in recent years. She was young but commanding, her presence in the courtroom radiating confidence and purpose. She had been preparing for this moment for months, gathering evidence, reviewing witness statements, and strategizing with Maria about how to make the most compelling case. On the other side of the courtroom, Garrett's legal team sat stoically. His lead defense attorney, Alan Brantley, was a seasoned trial lawyer known for defending law enforcement officers in cases of excessive force. He had a reputation for being ruthless and calculated, often employing tactics to paint victims as aggressors or unreliable witnesses. Today, he wore a crisp gray suit and sat with his hands folded neatly on the table in front of him, his eyes shifting occasionally toward Maria, as if sizing her up for the attack he would soon launch. As the trial began, Maria tried to steady her nerves. Her heart raced, and her hands were cold and clammy. James sat beside her, his jaw clenched, his hand resting protectively on her knee. This was the moment they had been waiting for, the moment where they would finally confront Garrett and the police department for what had happened. The first few days of the trial were dominated by witness testimony and the presentation of evidence. The prosecution laid out the events leading up to the incident with precision. They played the now viral video for the jury, showing the world once again the horrifying moment when Officer Garrett punched Maria in the face, sending her crumpling to the ground. The video had been filmed by multiple bystanders from different angles, providing a clear and undeniable view of what had taken place. As the video played, Maria kept her eyes down, unable to watch the moment that had upended her life. The gasps and murmurs from the audience told her enough. She could hear the horror and disbelief in the room as people saw what Garrett had done. But Garrett himself remained unmoved, staring straight ahead, his expression flat and devoid of emotion. Rebecca Wells stood before the jury, her voice steady but passionate. "What you just witnessed was not a moment of confusion or fear or panic," she said. "It was a moment of violence. Officer Garrett used unnecessary force on a pregnant woman, on a respected judge, without cause or reason. This case is about accountability. It's about whether we, as a society, are willing to hold those in power accountable for their actions, even when they wear a badge. But the defense was quick to respond. Alan Brantley approached the jury with an entirely different narrative. "Ladies and gentlemen, I understand the emotional response to what you've seen," he said, his voice calm and measured. "But we must remember that officers like Garrett are put in difficult situations every day. In the heat of the moment, with lives on the line, they have to make split-second decisions. This wasn't an act of malice. It was an unfortunate outcome in a situation where Garrett believed his own life might be at risk." The defense tried to frame Maria as resistant and uncooperative, suggesting that her actions had led to the escalation. They called Garrett to the stand to give his version of events, where he described the situation as one in which he felt threatened. His testimony was cold and calculated, with no hint of remorse. "I was following procedure," Garrett said firmly. "When I asked her to step out of the car, she didn't comply. I had reason to believe she was hiding something, or that she might be a danger. I regret that things escalated the way they did, but I stand by my actions. I did what I was trained to do." The courtroom buzzed with tension. Garrett's words hung in the air like smoke, his defense carefully crafted to paint himself as the victim of an overblown reaction. But as Rebecca stood to cross-examine him, the tone shifted. "Officer Garrett," she began, her voice sharp, "at what point did you realize that the woman you punched was 7 months pregnant?" Garrett hesitated, his gaze flickering. I wasn't aware of her condition at the time." Rebecca took a step closer, her eyes narrowing. "You weren't aware that she was visibly pregnant, that she was wearing maternity clothing, that she had told you she was pregnant before you assaulted her?" Garrett shifted uncomfortably in his seat. "In the moment, I was focused on securing the situation. And in that moment, you made a decision," Rebecca pressed. "A decision to use violence against a woman who posed no threat to you, and who was complying with your demands. Is that correct?" Garrett's silence was deafening. The trial reached its emotional peak when Maria took the stand. The courtroom fell silent as she walked to the witness box, every eye on her. This was the moment everyone had been waiting for, the moment when Maria herself would speak about what had happened. She sat down, her hands trembling slightly, but her resolve was strong. As Rebecca began to question her, Maria recounted the events of that day, her voice steady, though filled with emotion. "I didn't understand why I was being pulled over," she began. "I wasn't speeding. I wasn't breaking any laws. I was just running errands for my baby shower. When Officer Garrett asked me to step out of the car, I complied. But I told him, multiple times, that I was pregnant and that I needed to be careful. I didn't resist. I was afraid. And then he hit me." Her voice faltered for a moment, and the courtroom was completely silent, hanging on her every word. "I fell to the ground, and all I could think about was my baby," Maria continued, her voice breaking. I thought I was going to lose my child because of what he did." Rebecca placed a hand on Maria's shoulder, offering her a moment to collect herself before continuing. "And how has this incident affected you, Maria?" Rebecca asked gently. Maria looked down at her hands, clasped tightly in her lap. "It's changed everything. I'm still afraid to go outside. I'm afraid every time I see a police car. I was supposed to feel safe in my community. I'm a judge. I've spent my life upholding the law. And now, I don't know if I can ever trust the system again." Tears welled in her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. She had come too far to break down now. She needed to be strong, not just for herself, but for her baby, for James, and for everyone in Mapleton who had been watching and waiting for her to speak. The trial lasted for several weeks, with both sides presenting compelling arguments. But as the jury deliberated, the tension in the courtroom and the town reached a fever pitch. Protests continued outside the courthouse, with activists demanding justice for Maria, and the black community standing in solidarity with her. The thin blue line flags had disappeared from the streets, but the tension remained. Mapleton was holding its breath, waiting for the verdict that would either heal or deepen the divide. Finally, the day arrived. The jury had reached a decision. Maria sat beside James, her hand tightly gripping his. Her heart pounded in her chest as the judge asked the jury foreperson to stand and deliver the verdict. "We, the jury, find the defendant, Officer Garrett, guilty of assault." The words hung in the air for a moment, and then the courtroom erupted. Cheers broke out from Maria's supporters, while Garrett's legal team sat in stunned silence. Outside, the protests transformed into celebrations as news of the verdict spread. But for Maria, the moment was bittersweet. She had won the case, but the victory felt hollow. Nothing would undo the trauma she had experienced, or the fear that still lived in her heart. Still, it was a step forward. A step toward justice, not just for herself, but for everyone who had been failed by the system. Just when it seemed like the story was over, a shocking piece of evidence came to light. After the trial, a journalist working on an investigative report uncovered previously unseen dashcam footage from another police car that had arrived on the scene moments after Garrett punched Maria. The footage showed Garrett making racist remarks about Maria, revealing the deep-seated prejudice that had fueled his actions that day. The revelation sparked a new wave of outrage. Garrett's defense crumbled, and the police department faced further scrutiny for not releasing the footage earlier. Mapleton was thrown into chaos once again, with calls for a complete overhaul of the police department and demands for accountability from the highest levels of government. The months following the trial of Officer Garrett were a time of both healing and reckoning for Mapleton. The town had been torn apart by the incident and the subsequent legal battle, and while the guilty verdict brought a sense of closure to some, the community remained deeply divided. The revelation of the racist remarks in the newly discovered dashcam footage had only widened the chasm. People were forced to confront ugly truths that had long been buried beneath the surface. The police department was in disarray. Officer Garrett's conviction had sparked an internal investigation, and the chief of police, Chief Randolph, found himself at the center of a political firestorm. Calls for his resignation grew louder as evidence of systemic racism within the department came to light. Several officers who had previously stood by Garrett were suspended, and community leaders, including Reverend Charles McKinney, demanded comprehensive police reform. The town's black residents, who had long felt marginalized and silenced, were now more vocal than ever. They held town hall meetings, organized peaceful demonstrations, and pressed local officials to address not just the specific incident of Garrett's violence, but the broader institutional issues that had allowed someone like him to operate unchecked for so long. Mayor Daniel Wilson, still reeling from the aftermath of the trial, found himself in a difficult position. His attempt to stay neutral had backfired. The revelations from the dashcam footage had shown that the problem wasn't just Garrett. It was a much deeper, systemic issue. Under increasing pressure from both sides, Wilson finally decided to take decisive action. In a public statement, he announced a sweeping overhaul of the Mapleton Police Department. This included mandatory sensitivity and anti-bias training for all officers, the creation of a civilian oversight board to review incidents of police misconduct, and the hiring of an outside consultant to conduct a thorough audit of the department's practices. It was the most comprehensive reform the town had ever seen, and while it was met with some resistance, many in the community saw it as a necessary first step toward healing. For Maria Thompson, the aftermath of the trial was both a victory and a heavy burden. While the guilty verdict brought some measure of justice, the scars, both physical and emotional, remained. The physical wounds from Garrett's punch had healed, but the trauma lingered. She couldn't step outside her house without feeling a wave of anxiety. Every time she saw a police car, her heart raced, her mind flashing back to that terrible day when her life had been upended. James remained her rock, steadfast and supportive, but even he struggled with the weight of what they had endured. He had watched his wife become the face of a movement she never asked to lead, and while he admired her strength, he knew the cost it had exacted on her spirit. The birth of their daughter, Amelia, had been a beacon of hope amidst the darkness. Maria had spent weeks in the hospital following the attack, worried sick about her pregnancy, but the doctors had been able to manage the complications. When Amelia was finally born, healthy and full of life, Maria wept with relief. She had fought so hard for her baby. And now, holding her in her arms, she felt an overwhelming sense of purpose. Amelia represented everything Maria had been fighting for, a future where her daughter could grow up without fear, without the threat of violence because of the color of her skin. But motherhood came with its own set of challenges. Maria was determined to protect her daughter from the world that had so harshly treated her. She found herself questioning every decision, every potential interaction with authority. The protective instinct she had developed over her own life had intensified now that she had someone else to protect. As the weeks turned into months, Maria slowly began to re-enter public life. She resumed her role as a judge, though with a newfound perspective on the system she had once trusted so deeply. The courtrooms where she had once presided now felt different. She saw the faces of defendants, especially those from marginalized communities, with a sharper lens. She knew firsthand how the system could fail, how the deck could be stacked against people like her, and she was determined to do whatever she could to ensure fairness and equity in her courtroom. The town's reaction to the changes was mixed. Many in the Black community celebrated Maria's return to her judicial duties, seeing her as a symbol of resilience and justice. They attended court sessions just to watch her in action, knowing that she understood their struggles in a way few other judges could. Reverend McKinney, who had been a vocal supporter of Maria throughout the trial, organized a community event in her honor. Held at the local church, it was a celebration of her courage, her strength, and her commitment to justice. The event was attended by hundreds of residents, many of whom had been inspired by Maria's story. They listened as Maria, standing at the pulpit, spoke about her journey, about the importance of fighting for justice, and about the responsibility they all shared in making Mapleton a better place for the next generation. But not everyone was so enthusiastic. There were still those in town who believed that Officer Garrett had been railroaded, that the trial had been a farce driven by political correctness and media pressure. The pro-police factions continued to hold meetings in private, grumbling about the changes to the police department and vowing to restore order to Mapleton. Thin blue line flags, once prominently displayed in many yards, had become symbols of division, and while they had mostly disappeared from public view, they still remained in the hearts of those who saw Maria's fight for justice as an attack on their way of life. As the months passed, Maria began to find her voice in a new way. She had never sought the spotlight, but now that it was on her, she knew she had a responsibility to use it wisely. Civil rights organizations invited her to speak at national events, and she became a prominent advocate for police reform and racial justice. Her story resonated with people across the country, many of whom had experienced similar violence at the hands of law enforcement, but had never had the platform to speak out. She traveled to cities across the country, speaking to communities about the importance of holding law enforcement accountable, about the need for reform, and about the power of resilience. Her speeches were passionate and moving, but always grounded in the reality of her experience. She didn't present herself as a hero, just as someone who had been forced to make difficult choices in the face of injustice. At one particularly emotional event in Chicago, Maria stood before a crowd of thousands, many of whom held signs with her name and image. As she spoke about the importance of fighting for justice, she looked out into the crowd and saw people from all walks of life. Black, white, young, old, united by a common cause. "I never asked to be in this position," Maria said, her voice steady but filled with emotion. "I never wanted to become a symbol. I was just a woman, a teacher, a judge, trying to live my life. But when injustice happens, we don't always get to choose how we respond. Sometimes, the fight chooses us. And when it does, we have to be ready." The crowd erupted in applause, and Maria felt a sense of peace wash over her. She had found her purpose. What had happened to her was horrible, and the trauma would never fully go away. But she had transformed that pain into something powerful. She had become a voice for those who had been silenced, a beacon for those who had lost hope. As Mapleton slowly began to heal, the scars of the incident remained. The town would never be the same, but perhaps that was a good thing. The changes that had come about, both in the police department and in the hearts of the residents, were necessary, even if painful. The dialogue about race, justice, and equality that had been ignited by Maria's experience was ongoing, and while there was still much work to be done, there was a sense that things were moving in the right direction. For Maria, the journey was far from over. She continued her work as a judge, but she also embraced her new role as an advocate for change. She wrote a memoir about her experience, which became a bestseller and further amplified her voice on the national stage. She and James raised their daughter in a community that, while still grappling with its issues, was more aware and more engaged than ever before. In her closing chapter, Maria wrote, "We live in a world where fear and hatred can sometimes feel like they're winning. But I've learned that even in the darkest moments, there is hope. There is resilience. There is a power within us that can't be silenced, that refuses to give up. We don't get to choose our battles, but we do get to choose how we fight them. And if we fight with courage, with love, and with justice in our hearts, we can change the world." As Mapleton slowly began to heal, the scars of the incident remained. The town would never be the same, but perhaps that was a good thing. The changes that had come about, both in the police department and in the hearts of the residents, were necessary, even if painful. The dialogue about race, justice, and equality that had been ignited by Maria's experience was ongoing, and while there was still much work to be done, there was a sense that things were moving in the right direction. For Maria, the journey was far from over. She continued her work as a judge, but she also embraced her new role as an advocate for change. She wrote a memoir about her experience, which became a bestseller and further amplified her voice on the national stage. She and James raised their daughter in a community that, while still grappling with its issues, was more aware and more engaged than ever before. In her closing chapter, Maria wrote, "We live in a world where fear and hatred can sometimes feel like they're winning. But I've learned that even in the darkest moments, there is hope. There is resilience. There is a power within us that can't be silenced, that refuses to give up. We don't get to choose our battles, but we do get to choose how we fight them. And if we fight with courage, with love, and with justice in our hearts, we can change the world." As Mapleton slowly began to heal, the scars of the incident remained. The town would never be the same, but perhaps that was a good thing. The changes that had come about, both in the police department and in the hearts of the residents, were necessary, even if painful. The dialogue about race, justice, and equality that had been ignited by Maria's experience was ongoing, and while there was still much work to be done, there was a sense that things were moving in the right direction. For Maria, the journey was far from over. She continued her work as a judge, but she also embraced her new role as an advocate for change. She wrote a memoir about her experience, which became a bestseller and further amplified her voice on the national stage. She and James raised their daughter in a community that, while still grappling with its issues, was more aware and more engaged than ever before. In her closing chapter, Maria wrote, "We live in a world where fear and hatred can sometimes feel like they're winning. But I've learned that even in the darkest moments, there is hope. There is resilience. There is a power within us that can't be silenced, that refuses to give up. We don't get to choose our battles, but we do get to choose how we fight them. And if we fight with courage, with love, and with justice in our hearts, we can change the world." As Mapleton slowly began to heal, the scars of the incident remained. The town would never be the same, but perhaps that was a good thing. The changes that had come about, both in the police department and in the hearts of the residents, were necessary, even if painful. The dialogue about race, justice, and equality that had been ignited by Maria's experience was ongoing, and while there was still much work to be done, there was a sense that things were moving in the right direction. For Maria, the journey was far from over. She continued her work as a judge, but she also embraced her new role as an advocate for change. She wrote a memoir about her experience, which became a bestseller and further amplified her voice on the national stage. She and James raised their daughter in a community that, while still grappling with its issues, was more aware and more engaged than ever before. In her closing chapter, Maria wrote, "We live in a world where fear and hatred can sometimes feel like they're winning. But I've learned that even in the darkest moments, there is hope, there is resilience. There is a power within us that can't be silenced, that refuses to give up. We don't get to choose our battles, but we do get to choose how we fight them. And if we fight with courage, with love, and with justice in our hearts, we can change the world." As Maria stood on the steps of the courthouse after her book signing in Mapleton, a reporter asked her a question that lingered in her mind. "What do you think the future holds for Mapleton, for the country, in light of everything that's happened?" Maria paused, thinking carefully before she spoke. "I think the future is what we make it," she said. "We have a choice. We can either turn away from the truth, pretend that everything is fine, or we can face it head-on and do the hard work of making things better. It's up to us, every single one of us, to decide what kind of world we want to live in."